Good evening. It's good to see everyone out. It's good to have Brother Norm back with us, at least feeling well enough to be here. All right, so we touched on question number 2 last week, and at this point, with the time remaining, if we touch on it, we're going to count it as done. So we're going to move on to question 3. Yeah. All right. So it says, let's list and discuss some of the new relationships produced by a marriage. What principles should guide and govern these new relationships? And before we answer that, I did mean to say something at the very beginning. I know we've got some people that are watching on YouTube. And if you are watching and you have questions or you have comments, we would welcome those. And you can text them to Jesse Flowers at 281-515-8939. We definitely want you to feel like you're a part of the class, and sometimes maybe you might miss something and need clarification on something. So if you are watching on YouTube, again, we would welcome you to participate, and that number again is 281-515-8939. All right, so of course, coming into a marriage, you do have a lot of new relationships, and so before you answer the question, I'm going to read. And this is from one of the books that I can't remember who this is from, but it says, marriage and the formation of a home produce a number of new and varied relationships. Marriage immediately turns a man into a husband and a woman into a wife. The coming of a child sometime later turns the husband into a father and the wife into a mother. Entrance into the marriage means that a closer tie is formed with the family of the marital mate. Unless the parents of the mate are dead, there is an entrance into the relationship of son-in-law and daughter-in-law. These parents in turn become father-in-law and mother-in-law to the one who has married their child. If the mate has brothers or sisters, there will be the formation of brother-in-law and or sister-in-law also. Every couple should be aware of the ramifications of these new relationships. It is not true that one marries only the mate and has no subsequent relationships with his or her family. We marry into a family, and there will certainly be relationships with each in-law. So I answered the first part of the question for you. There's a lot of new relationships that start whenever you have a marriage. And this is important for multiple reasons, but one reason is to make sure that we're teaching our young, whenever you get married, you're not just marrying the person. And so it has a huge effect on your relationship, the family dynamic that your spouse is coming from, with the parents, with the siblings, and so it can have a huge impact on your marriage as a whole. So listed all of these different new relationships. So what principles should guide us and govern us in these new relationships? Bonnie? Sorry?
The same principles that guide us outside those relationships.
Okay, we need to put specifics on. We're not speaking in generalities right now. We have specifics.
Being a Christian,
because that answers the question for the whole class.
it doesn't change. The things that you have to do and be as a Christian doesn't change with relationships. What it changes is the attention to the details that you're paying and the effort that you're putting into it. You have to put a whole lot more effort into someone that you're going to live with as opposed to somebody down the street. And so the attention to detail with that is one thing that changes. But the kindness, the caring, the sacrificial love that you have, all the things, these are things we're demanded to be just as living human beings and servants of God. That doesn't change being married, but how we view our partner and how we then apply that to our partner changes. And then how we apply that to their family changes. But all of those same things, those principles continue to be the actual roadmap for us.
Okay.
Which the rest of the world throws out the window for some reason.
Let me get Bonnie, I'll get you Norm.
So thinking about like new relationships, I mean, you and your spouse are now, I was thinking about how now within the church you are a new family unit, and maybe you're a young married couple, and you might have new friendships that you develop with other young couples in church. And I was just thinking about that, thinking back to when we were a young couple and how we would get together with other young couples and have Bible studies to edify one another and to grow spiritually. And that was such good encouragement because we were all kind of going through the same phase of life during that time. But then also thinking of yourself in terms of hospitality, what you're going to do with that, with your new relationship, and how you're going to share with the church, and also, of course, financially, what you're going to give to the church. Just that whole new family unit. There's so many opportunities there, and it's good to discuss those and think about your relationship as a couple with other couples and other people in church.
Okay.
Norm?
Some of the power of influence is never more important than when you're looking at those new relationships that you've built with the relatives of your spouse. You've dealt with your relatives for a certain period of time and know the ins and outs of that. But the discussions that you have, because there's a great tie-in. They're as close, you know. These relationships are close on that your spouse's side as it is on yours, from the standpoint of the power of influence on you. So there are some other considerations now that you need to bring up. They could be very sticky matters, you know, and it just, these are things that now you have to, as a husband and wife, you should have talked about it a little, you know, before you got married. It's a pretty powerful influence there, the grandparents. But if you haven't, you have to now implement that stuff, and it's going to take some changes in that relationship.
Yeah, and that's one that
Wasn't listed here, but that's a huge one. I mean, it's one thing for your in-laws to be an influence to you, but when you bring children into the relationship, now they're going to have an influence on your children, and that's something that you do have to think about, especially if you've got grandparents that are not faithful. How are you going to handle the situation with the kids, and you know, when they want to keep them on a Sunday or a Wednesday night? So there are a lot of aspects of that yes, definitely need to be thought about and discussed ahead of time. So just going along with what Norm P. said, that's basically the answer that I gave, but I have a lot of passages, and the first one is Matthew 7, verse 12, which is what? The golden rule, okay? That's a pretty good one. And so regardless of it, your in-laws or whoever that's been brought into the relationship, we always need to remember that. Treat others the way that we want to be treated. And then Bonnie brought up hospitality in regards to the new relationship with, you know, husband and wife, and now with the church. But Romans 12:13, contributing to the needs of the saints, practicing hospitality. And that's something that, as Christians, should just be a principle, you know, that we follow. And so that should include, you know, your in-laws. I have 1 Corinthians 16:13 and 14. Be on alert, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. Let all that you do be done in love. So there's a lot right there that could really affect your relationship with in-laws, because you can be influenced. And you might consider yourself to be very strong, but if your in-laws have an influence on your spouse and they're trying to convince you or the family to maybe go on some trip, or you're going to miss services, or there's a number of things that could happen that they could weaken your faith, well, you've got to make sure that you stand firm, but make sure that you're doing so out of love. Galatians 6:10, you know, do good to all right? And so if you have opportunity to do good to your in-laws, do that. And then we've talked about Philippians 2 several times, but regard one another is more important than yourselves. That doesn't change just because they're your in-laws, all right? And so that's just basic principles that I think will help us govern these new relationships and help us handle these new relationships. All right, anything else on number 3? All right, now for the fun ones. All right, so question number 4, I'm giving hypothetical situations that I call them hypothetical, but they're actually real life situations that we need to be aware of and need to make sure that we understand how that we can handle these situations, especially if they happen to us, but then if they're happening to those that are around us and we're trying to counsel someone else. So I say, how should the following situations be handled? How would you counsel someone that came to you with the issues below? And so the first one that I have there is a wife is concerned. Her husband is getting very violent. She is worried about the safety of her children and herself. So how would you handle that situation? How would you counsel someone that was in that situation? And this question came up by Brother Jesse Jackson a few classes ago, just about, protecting yourself or your family just in general. So I'd like to talk about that some too, kind of going along with this. But
Are you talking about being members of the church or people that are not?
I'm talking about members of the church.
Okay, well, they need to read Ephesians 5:28 and 29.
Okay?
It says, so husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one either hates his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. So if they're both Christians, you can go to the Word of God and give them advice. If they're not, then, well, even if they are Christian, you might want to tell them they need counseling.
Okay? So,
yeah, let's just, for the sake of discussion, all of these questions are going to relate to Christians that are married to Christians, so they're both Christians. And so what you would hope is both spouses have at least a basic understanding as Christians of what the expectations are of the other, as far as, love and respect and honor. And so still with that, though, you've got a husband that's being violent. And so Sister Shirley said that if it's bad enough that recommend that they get counseling. So, what else? Lena?
If your husband is getting very violent, I'm sorry, but he's not being a Christian, a person that's following the Christian principles, and he's loving his wife as Christ loved the church. So my suggestion might not be the Christian-like suggestion, but I would say flee. Because first of all, very violent means that he's not just like grabbing and, okay, you better shut up or something. But that means he's very violent. First of all, I would put children in safety and herself in safety. And maybe then do counseling on the outside, but not within the house. That's just me.
okay.
The person is a Christian. They're sinning. This is sin. It doesn't mean that they're not a Christian. They're just in sin. This is not an extreme example. I want everybody to understand this. This is not, and this is real life that happens very often. And so this is something that if you haven't already, I would say that many of you will be confronted with this at some point in your life. Drew?
I was going to say, if it's gotten to this point, obviously the wife is very concerned, and if she brings it to the men of the church or the elders, then I think it's time for the men and the elders to intervene. And if that involves law enforcement or whatever to protect somebody, then I feel like that's the direction you have to go. I mean, you should try it without, obviously, but I mean,
You should try without what?
without law enforcement, I guess. I don't know. But initially, it's just.
I just wanted to clarify what. Okay?
So bringing it to the men, bringing it to the elders, possibly bringing it before the law. Norm?
First thought on questions like these is some background information. Is this something the way he's always been, or is this a sudden change or occurrences that happened? Because that could point to either a trauma, a recent trauma. Maybe he was in a car accident, seemed to walk out just fine, and wasn't checked out enough. Maybe he's returning from a battlefield. Maybe he's got a tumor. I mean, there's any number of things that can very suddenly switch somebody's personality to where they've gone from somebody who would never think of such things to doing such things. And so that would be one of my first questions on this one is this something that he has always had a violent tendency and now it's just gotten worse? Or is it something where he has been mild-mannered for most of his life and there is nobody that can point to him and say, yeah, that guy's got a temper and he just beats the tar out of whoever comes across him. But ever since this accident, he's been acting up and now she's got this concern. I mean, To me, that points to very, very different things. Confronting him about his sin is still doing it. The accident doesn't excuse what he's doing. But then pointing him towards perhaps what he might need for help for his condition, be it a medical condition with a tumor or dealing with PTSD. I mean, any number of things that could be the cause of this if this is a sudden occurrence.
Okay. Norm?
The goal overall is, the highest principle is the spiritual principle. So and we have sin involved here. So the idea is to try to ameliorate, stop the sinning. And to be able to do that, going to the folks that would have the best answer for sin would be the leadership within the congregation and the members of the congregation that know them and the Bible the best. That's always going to be the ultimate goal we have to keep in mind, not just stopping this particular violent behavior, but in correcting the sin. And the Bible gives us the guidance for that. But at the same time, to knowingly know that the wife and children are in danger and take no action to get them to a safer condition first, before you deal with the sin. You don't want to make the sin worse by keeping them in the sinful situation that's going on there. And of course, it could get worse as the violence does. So,
Okay.
I think we're hitting on.
I think you started at the
And
end.
then work toward the beginning. So yeah, the end result is the soul of the person that is committing the sin, that is being violent. We do care about their soul. And so that is the ultimate goal, that they need to be restored. But the immediate thing is what I'm going to call self-preservation. All right? And so then my question to everyone is, does God allow us to self-preserve? Bonnie?
Well, not only is he sinning, but he's also breaking the law. I mean, you're not allowed to, it's assault and battery. You're not allowed to go around and hurt people. So, I mean, if it's an immediate situation where things are out of control and you feel threatened, I think it's perfectly fine to call the police and get them involved because they're breaking the law.
And we are to be obeyers of the law.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here we have to think about.
Marissa?
There's a difference between separation and divorce. And we're permitted to separate under other circumstances. But in an issue where your physical body and that of your children is potentially in danger, separation is not divorce.
Okay, so I'll ask the question.
Again, does God allow us the right of self-preservation? Jesse Jackson.
So Herod wanted to kill all the babies, because he heard about a Messiah, and they were told to evacuate. Same thing in Egypt with Moses. So she disobeyed a commandment to preserve her son, and it was totally fine because God blessed the process, and she wound up nursing him. So the answer is just yes. And in both of those cases, that was a case of fleeing. And actually, if you remember, Jesus even went into Egypt and said, I'll call my son out of Egypt. So they didn't do it just once. So I'm totally okay with that. And not just because Lena threatened me if I didn't agree with it, but I just...
You can't grab your shoulder and say you said that.
Hey, on my wedding in Ukraine, I was threatened with the Russian mafia, dude. So I just, I take them people seriously, okay?
We'll do that in
The fifth part of this one. Sam?
Jesus went to Galilee because in the beginning of the chapter, just because the Jews were trying to kill him. So he's a pretty good example to follow.
Yeah, so
Brother Jesse Jackson listed one example. I think that we've got multiple examples that show us the right of self-protection, and I think Jesus is a great example of that. He did it not only in John chapter 7, but he did it in John chapter 8 as well, John chapter 13, chapter 17, chapter 18. Now, in most of these situations, if not all of them, I have to go back and double check. It's miraculous in many of the situations, but the fact still remains, he fled from a site where he was potentially in fear of his life. Now, there was a greater plan that he had to finish, and that wasn't the time, and so he fled. In John chapter 18, when he was responding to Pilate's question about whether or not he was the king of the Jews, he said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight that I should not be delivered into the hands of the Jews?" So he wasn't opposing the fighting, but his kingdom was not of this world. In Matthew chapter 24 and verse 16, Jesus told those of Judea to flee to the mountains. In Luke chapter 11, the parable there, verses 21 and 22, in correcting a false allegation about the casting out of devils, Jesus said, when a strong man, fully armed, guards his own palace, his goods are safe, but when one stronger than he attacks him and overcomes him, he takes away his armor in which he is trusted and divides his spoil. So there's a strong man that's fully armed, and he's there to protect his house. In Matthew chapter 24 and verse 43, Jesus said, if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, would he have not watched and not allowed his house to be broken into? So that's not just, I'm just watching and just, he's protecting his house. And if he would have known what time the thief was going to be coming, that's the purpose of it. In Acts chapter 9, and multiple places in Acts, we see Paul being protected, and oftentimes by other Christians that were helping him, and he's fleeing danger, the potential of his life. And then I look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and what does it say about our body? It's the temple of God. And so I think that, and there are a lot more examples that we can look at, but God allows us the right of self-preservation. And so no woman needs to sit there and take a beating, nor does she need to allow her children to be taking a beating from her husband. And so, I think first and foremost, they need to flee. They need to remove themselves from that situation. The second thing that has been mentioned, Drew and then Bonnie also mentioned it, the guy's broke the law. All right? Forget the fact that he's in sin. He's broke the law, and he needs to be dealt with according to the law. Romans chapter 13. There's a reason that the government is there. It is to punish the evildoers. If you're doing good, you have no fear. But if you're not, then you need to fear. And so there is consequences for your actions. If he's out just in the world and he's whooping up on somebody, he's going to be arrested and suffer the consequences. It's no different just because it's now inside his own home. All right, so that needs to happen. But then, and a couple of you have mentioned this, I think that ultimately the guy's soul needs to be tended to. And so in that situation, that's when you get the church involved. And if you do have elders of the congregation, then they need to be brought into that situation, and they need to be working with the wife and also the husband. And the consequences may be that he's got to be in prison for some time. Okay, but his soul can still be restored even when he's in that condition. And so there are several things that have to be thought about and need to be considered whenever you are in that situation. And the fact that sin has occurred, then that sin needs to be dealt with. But there are things that need to, safety is first. Sam?
Is this like a Matthew 18 situation where, like, if they're both Christians and this wife's husband is her brother, so he sinned against her. So would she most likely need to talk with just a few people first and bring, a couple with her to talk with the husband, whether it's in prison or whether it's at their home, and then get the entire church involved? Like, would she be sinning by getting the church involved before talking with him with just a couple people?
So once the law is involved and there's an arrest, more than likely there would be an arrest made. And so now this is public. I think that in actually almost all of these situations, we need to think about Matthew chapter 18 and how that we would handle those situations. But I think that once it's gone public, you're beyond now just the husband and the wife, coming together. Now if it's there's going to be varying levels of violence, physical and verbal. And obviously if it's just verbal violence, because you can be abused verbally, he hasn't broken a law. he's broken God's law, but he hasn't broken the law of the land. So yes, I do think that Matthew 18 is something that we would definitely need to consider, because Matthew 18 does not specify, okay, only if it's this sin or it's this sin, and so spousal, English is hard. Spousal abuse is sinful, and so, yeah, it's going to be covered under Matthew chapter 18. Other comments or questions, Brother Bill?
A lot of elements of that, as far as being in the moment where somebody is threatened with danger, I wholly recommend what everybody's saying here, to flee, to get away from it. Often substance abuse is involved if somebody, gets progressively more and more violent, and that person cannot be reasoned with in the moment. I mean, he might be able to be counseled later on, but the idea of getting away from the danger, I've had some experience with this growing up, and that's definitely the first thing you do.
Yeah. So I think that it was Marissa that brought up about divorce, and so we've already spent enough time on this. This is not grounds for divorce, okay? And there are Christians out there today that are telling people in these situations that they should get a divorce. This is not grounds for divorce. It's a horrible situation and needs to be dealt with, but it doesn't give a right for a wife to divorce her husband because of it. All right, anything else on the first scenario? All right, the second one, a husband has lost all interest in sex and refuses to have sex with his wife. So this is, the reason I put that one up there is because I'm fixing to read something to you that was a Christian sending a message asking for advice. So the wife says, "We know the only way God approves of divorce is adultery. What about when your spouse will not sleep with you? No sexual acts for 3 months or more, and before the shut off, it was slowly cut off. Only married 1 year. What about the fact that he does not show any kind of love? Is this reason to divorce? I have talked to him and prayed, and I have been patient. He tells me I have to love God more than I do him, and he has to show me that. Does God want me to stay with him and live like this?" So, how would you counsel someone in that situation? Or how would you deal with it if you were in that situation? This stuff ain't easy, but this is real life.
He doesn't have that authority. He gave that up to her.
Right, so we know that,
Other direction around. I mean, it's.
so we talked about that in the last lesson.
In regards to defrauding your spouse, which this is the definition of defrauding your spouse, so we know that it's sin. This isn't allowed, but this is happening. So now what? I mean, we just go to him and tell him 1 Corinthians 7 and Sam?
Dude, you get. It'd be kind of awkward, but is that the right thing to do?
I mean, this is,
I mean, what I just read, that's awkward. Yeah, it's a very awkward situation. All right, let me get a couple more comments and then we'll answer that. Marissa and then Bonnie.
I don't have anything other than that specific for this, but the hard part about all of these is that one party is definitely sinning, and based on what you read, like, they don't have an interest in changing. And that's what makes it so difficult, is like, it's very clear what they should be doing, but they don't seem to feel that they need to change. And if they're not acknowledging that they are sinning, and they're not acknowledging a problem, or they're not acknowledging that they should be changing, it's a rock and a hard place. And that's what makes it so difficult.
we get by now.
Yeah, I think what Marissa said is very true, and this is a sin that we're dealing with in this scenario. And so, I mean, I guess the first thing you would do is try to talk with your spouse and try to communication, try to get that rolling and try to figure out why, what's the reason behind it. Obviously try to work through it with him, but outside of that, I guess the next thing you would do would be what Sam is saying. Bring it before maybe the elders, a couple of people in the church, and try to, because it's a sin issue.
Based on your letter, right, then what this is it's a change in behavior a few months in, and if it's not medical, it's intentional. Sounds like it's intentional, right, the way that it was done. So this is like, I don't know, the beginning or the middle of the process. And I guess my point is that, and I'm just trying to be inside the person's head, but if this is the intentional thing because he regrets marrying this person because it's that early in their marriage, I would, again, if you're in an environment that's not hostile, yes, the 1 Corinthians 7 kind of thing applies, but I wouldn't advise the person just run and get divorced. You're going to have to just see what this person does. And is he really apparently that early in life interested in living the whole rest of his life with no one or not? Because it would suggest to me that, again, if he has some kind of regret or something, he's going to look somewhere else. And I would not advise somebody to be like preemptive and just divorcing somebody until you know. I've actually, the words have come out of my mouth. Why would you let go of what you got unless you got something else? And some of this stuff just needs the time. And it needs some discovery and some investigation, obviously, the other points that you have here as well. So I would simply just, again, if the person's not in a physically hostile environment, you kind of wait it out and you see what's around the corner.
Yeah, I think it's interesting.
The lady that wrote this, I mean, her very first sentence is, "We know the only way God approves of divorce is adultery," but then she continues to ask, does God really want me to stay in this situation? So it's like she knows the truth, but surely God wouldn't want me to stay in a situation where my husband doesn't want to be with me. And I think that would be a very, very difficult situation. So I think starting off, and it sounds like she has communicated some with the husband, and there needs to be some specifics, I think, with that. I think that out of love, one, for his soul, but also for the longevity of the relationship and the marriage, there needs to be some pretty blunt discussion about this is sinful. That this is something that as a married couple that God has allowed us, not just allowed us, but this is something that is commanded between the husband and a wife. And so that needs to be discussed through very plainly, with the wife in regards to the husband. And then I do think that, like Brother Jesse said, there needs to be some time. I mean, we can't just, on a Friday have this conversation and we don't like what happened, so now then Sunday we're fixing to go to and bring it before the congregation. That can't happen. That doesn't need to happen. But I do think, to answer Sam's question, yes, there is sin, and so Matthew chapter 18, I think, is something that would apply. And what makes it a whole lot harder is because when it's any other sin, or most any other sin, I think that it's easier for us to talk about. But when it's our sexual relationship with our spouse, that's not something that we want to talk about. That's not something that we would want to go to the elders and talk about. But it may be something that needs to happen if it doesn't get better, because there is a continuation of this unrepentant sin. Norm?
One of the first things you're going to have to sort out in this is whether or not it's a physical issue with the man, or in this particular case, if it's the man and it is the husband, is it a physical condition or is it a mental condition? Is it a decision that he's making irregardless of the physical condition? Because again, this may be an area where they're not talking at all, or very little communication is going on. Certainly male physical problems with their sex drive and stuff is well documented within the society, and men don't like talking about that kind of stuff. And sometimes they don't talk about it. They talk about it with somebody other than their wife, and that should be the first person you're talking to them about. And so, you know, we need to find out if it's a medical issue or if this is a decision that he made. If it's a medical issue, now we're not talking about sin. Maybe we're talking now about something that could be corrected. But
So, I mean, yeah, with all of these, we can get into 10 or 20 different hypotheticals of what about this, what about that. But even in that situation, if it's a medical thing, if they're not communicating that with their spouse, there's still a problem that needs to be dealt with. And I'm not going to get into entirely this whole next one, but there's another one that same situation where they had sent this in to get input, and it says this is rather personal, but do I have to sleep with my husband? Don't get me wrong, I love him dearly, but I have a huge fear of getting pregnant that I just can't enjoy the moment. So again, this stuff is real. All right, this is real life, even amongst the church and Christians, and so things that we have to be prepared for. Sam, real quick.
I guess you moved on to that now, so mine's not entirely relevant anymore.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm sorry.
All right. Anything else on the? What's that?
abortion shows up with married couples, and the wife doesn't want to have any more children, and there you go. And so there's.
I mean, in all of these situations, we have to be careful that we don't use situational ethics. And it's kind of like the lady at the beginning says, I know that God doesn't allow divorce except for adultery, but look at the situation I'm in. Surely God wouldn't want me to be in this situation. All right, so like with the first scenario, the second scenario, still it's not grounds for divorce. All right, the third one. A married couple is facing problems because the husband is more committed to his job. She wants him to spend more time with her and the kids. JJ?
This is just a matter of priorities, and this is something that should be discussed. If people are willing to forego certain other dreams and goals and plans and aspirations to realign their priorities, that's what they ought to do.
Yeah, we can't kind of throw these last two together. They are very similar. So the last one says a married couple is facing problems because although the husband and wife both have secular jobs, the wife wants to be alone every evening because she wants me time. And at the beginning of class, you may not have heard, but Miss Shirley said, "What is me time?" And Miss Shirley's generation, it wasn't no me time, but trust me, this is a thing now. And it's like, I got to have me time. All right? So both of these, I mean, even the first situation where maybe he's at work, maybe it's because he don't want to have we time. JJ?
Jesus went up on the mountain for some me time when the crowds were gone. And Lena does stay up on the couch sometimes crocheting or knitting something an hour after the kids go to bed. And I get that, okay? I get that. And, you know, for what it's worth, there's been times I've went in there and I sat with her for a little while. Not last night because I had to get up at 4 this morning. But the point is, it's a communication thing. But that to me is understandable.
Yeah. Drew?
I was going to say, all of these as well tie back to selfishness. So that's the main problem, period, in marriage, I guess.
Absolutely.
Everything goes back to that.
Yes. It all ties back to selfishness. Even the first two tie back to selfishness. Norm?
It's easy to get caught up sometimes in the providing part of what you're doing as a husband, and forgetting that that's only part of the provision, and that's only part of the love. There's another part of it, which is the attention to her, that is equally as important as the provision part. And so you can't promote one over the other. You have to work and find the balance. And oftentimes it's probably just hey, you're doing this a little bit too much, and just realizing, okay, I need to refocus. And as a man, that's something I have to watch out for it, because I can absolutely fall into I've gotten focused on work, and I'm not focusing enough on things around the house because I'm focused on work, and I've got to because I've got to pay bills and I've got to make sure food's on the table, and it's really easy to get wrapped up on that.
It's really easy to justify.
And it's super easy to justify it, but like, sometimes you just need to kick the pants, hey, that's part of it. The other part is looking at her, looking after the kids, being the father and husband at home that you're supposed to be.
And
Three things. In these scenarios, we got to make sure that we don't compound sin with more sin. So, that's in all these scenarios, that's one thing. Another thing is that training our children from a young age, teaching them this process of how it is the Bible wants the family unit to be and to act and behave. That will go a long way when they get older. And then the third thing is, I know that we've suggested counseling in a lot of these scenarios, but the problem with counselors is the worldly counselors are going to give you worldly advice, and it's not good. And so if you go the counseling route, make sure that you pick a counselor that is somebody that's within the church or that has at least a Bible background that's not going to complicate things worse than they already are.
yeah.
So I think a passage, and we've talked about it many times, really with both of these, is 1 Peter 3, verse 7. We may see things a certain way, and spending time together may not be as important, but we have to live with our wives in an understanding way, and so that we have to be understanding of their needs and also the needs of our children as well in all of these situations. But again, 1.2, with all of these, there's no grounds for divorce. And also, with all of these things, you better think about them, because once you make that decision, and once you're married for life. And so it's a very, very important decision. All right, so I know we haven't done it yet. We're going to try to get through 5 and 6 and then lesson 5 next week. Lesson 5 is talking about discipline. Thanks, everybody.